Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the DTRF's Dealing with Desmoids event tonight. This is actually our 6th installment of the Dealing with Desmoids webinar series. These events aim to bring coping strategies to the desmoid tumor patient community. And tonight's webinar topic is survivor guilt and toxic positivity. I would like to introduce you to Ashley Williams, who is the host of Dealing with Desmoids. Ashley is a licensed clinical social worker and a trauma counselor from South Florida. In 2015, she was diagnosed with a desmoid tumor in her left leg. Since then, she has become passionate about helping patients heal from the trauma of their diagnosis and treatment. Her focus is on those with desmoids, cancer, chronic illness, and other rare diseases. Having undergone multiple rounds of treatment herself, Ashley believes in a holistic mind and body approach to healing. She continues to help individuals from these communities work through their trauma in her counseling practice. So I will say, let's see, welcome, Ashley. And before we get started, I just have a few instructions for everyone joining us today. So we welcome questions via the Q&A. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So if you have a question for Ashley, please share it there and she will try to get to it at the end of her presentation. Also, you'll see that the chat function is open for you to use to communicate with community members. This chat will not be monitored. So if you have any questions, don't put them in the chat. If you want to share something with the community, if you want to share something about your experience, please feel free to do it in the chat. And again, the Q&A is just for questions that you have for Ashley. Okay. So I hope that everyone enjoys this session, and now I will kick it over to Ashley.
Thank you, Lynn. I am really excited to be back. As Lynn shared, it's been a while. This is our 6th installment of Dealing with Desmoids, but it's been about 6 months since the last training. I'm very much still in my desmoid experience. And so over the last 6 months have been going through not treatment necessarily for my desmoid, but treatment to fix some of the deformities that were a result of my desmoid. So I'm out of a couple of surgeries and some recovery that I was doing. And it is just a wonderful, wonderful feeling to be back, to feel a little bit human again, and to be able to share topics that I feel are so pertinent to our community. A lot of the trainings that we've done before, the topics that we've done before, have been focused on trauma and how trauma affects our bodies and making meaning of our experience. But my heart is very close to this topic in particular, because as a desmoid patient, I feel like the things that we're going to be talking about this evening are just so pertinent and interwoven in our experience. We are going to be talking about 3 things today. The title shows 2 different things, but I threw another one in there that we're going to be talking about as well. And so today we're going to be talking about survivor's guilt, toxic positivity, but also imposter syndrome. These 3 things might seem like they're very, very different, but in reality, they are all very closely related, and they all tend to show up pretty extensively in the desmoid experience in particular, just because of the classification of our tumor. And so as we try to find community, and as we maybe try to find community in cancer communities and in other areas, these 3 things, survivor's guilt, imposter syndrome, and toxic positivity, tend to show up and tend to just, again, be a very deep and core part of our experience, one that I've heard a lot of desmoid patients share feelings of before. So today we're going to be talking about these 3 things, what they are, how do we experience them, and then how do we cope with them. So for each topic, we're going to be talking about exactly what it is. How does it show up for us? How do we behave? How do we experience it? How does it affect our feelings and our emotions and our behaviors? And then what are different things that we can do to cope when these three things pop up for us? The first thing we're going to be talking about is survivor's guilt. Now, what is it exactly? The definition of survivor's guilt is feelings of guilt that occur after surviving a life-threatening, traumatic event when others did not. Now, typically, when we talk about survivor's guilt, our minds tend to think about it in line with bereavement and specifically bereavement. And when we talk about survivor's guilt, yes, it does apply to bereavement, but there are so many intricacies and complexities that go along with survivor's guilt. We're going to go through a lot of those today just to see how they show up specifically for a desmoid tumor patient. Now, as I just stated, for desmoid patients, guilt can be experienced for reasons that extend far beyond simply surviving our diagnosis. So how do we experience it? The first I mentioned, and I think is the one that we would be more acquainted with whenever we're talking about or thinking about what is survivor's guilt and how does it apply to me? And we tend to think about it specifically in terms of bereavement. Now, that might be the case for us as desmoid patients when we're trying to connect with our desmoid community. We tend to relate our experience to the experience of other desmoid patients, but we might also relate our experience to those within the larger cancer community, even though we may not necessarily feel like we belong in that community all the time. And so survivor's guilt, we're going to be talking specifically about how do we relate to other people who have a desmoid tumor or maybe who have a cancer diagnosis or a chronic illness, and how do we kind of compare ourselves to another person's experience. So survivor's guilt can pop up whenever we have these feelings, like I said, of bereavement. If we're looking at somebody who maybe has passed from a diagnosis, from an illness, from an injury, and the thoughts begin to come up, the guilt begins to come up of why that person, like why did that person go through so much pain? Why did that person go through so much distress? Why did that person not get a chance at living their life? And I did. And the fact that I am still here, and the fact that I am still living, and the fact that I am still able to enjoy and engage in life and this other person is not, that brings up and can bring up kind of intense feelings of guilt. But like I mentioned, it's not just bereavement that brings up these feelings of survivor's guilt. It is a whole host of other things that relate to our experience. The next one is news of a recurrence in a fellow patient. Now, I know with a desmoid tumor, we don't necessarily typically have the experience of being NED or being cured or not having our desmoid tumor anymore. But I think we have all experienced times where we have connected with somebody else, especially a desmoid patient, and we have learned that they have had to go back to treatment, that their tumor is growing, that it needs to be addressed. And so now, after a period of time, they have to go back to treatment. And we can develop feelings of guilt whenever maybe we are in a season of not having to go through treatment, or we're in a season of stability or maybe even shrinkage with our tumor, but we hear about someone that we care about, somebody that we connected with online, somebody that we know personally, somebody who maybe has a cancer diagnosis in our personal life. We can feel those extreme feelings of guilt whenever we hear, okay, they have to go back into the fire, so to speak. They have to go back into the experience of going through some sort of treatment. And I'm doing okay right now. I'm stable right now. I don't have to go back to treatment right now. Those feelings can come on really, really strong whenever we start engaging with the desmoid community. There are so many people that I have had the opportunity to speak to in the desmoid community, and I often get people who are reaching out to me via social media who have just learned that they have a desmoid tumor and their doctor has told them, we're going to do the watch and wait method. And so I have been through multiple rounds of treatment, multiple procedures, and just different things. And I've had many people say to me, oh, well, I'm just doing watch and wait. Like, my experience is different. My experience isn't as bad. And often we tend to compare our experiences to other people based off of the things that they've been through. And then as a result, those feelings of guilt can come up of, who am I to even be upset? Or who am I to feel pain or grief or uncertainty or anxiety when I've seen so many other people in the desmoid community go through so many treatments? Now, from a mental health perspective, I will tell you that those who are diagnosed at a low stage, I know that we're not staged necessarily, but those who are diagnosed with cancer at a low stage, or who don't have a stage, or who have yet to go through any sort of treatment, those people tend to not seek help for their mental health because of this, because of survivor's guilt. Because I'm looking at other people who have been through different, and maybe I perceive them as more difficult experiences than I have. And so I am not worthy to access those resources. I've heard people say that before. And my response is no. Once you receive a diagnosis, once you learn about a desmoid tumor, regardless of what your treatment course or your treatment path has been, your life is completely changed. At that point, you are constantly worrying about how things are going to turn out. Is it going to grow? Is it going to come back? There's anxiety that's associated with it. There is just a recognition that life is short and that life can change in any moment. And so survivor's guilt can pop up in kind of these sneaky ways of the ways that we compare ourselves to other people. And the fact that we might deem our experience as less than or inferior based off of what I see other people go through and other people walk through. But again, regardless of the treatment options that you've been through, being diagnosed with a desmoid, being diagnosed with cancer, anything along those lines, it is a traumatic experience. And so all of the overwhelming feelings that come up with that deserve and are worthy of being addressed. Now, the next one is having a diagnosis at an earlier stage. I mentioned that, and especially as desmoid tumor patients, I cannot tell you how many times I have heard people say, like, but it's not cancer, but it's not that bad, but I have a good kind. I've had doctors tell me, at least you have the good kind of rare disease. I'm like, what is the good kind of rare disease? Like, what does that mean? You know, I don't think any rare diseases are good. But we tend to qualify our experience or value our experience based off of how it compares to other people. And with a desmoid tumor, especially not having the classification of cancer, we tend to, I see it a lot in the people that I work with, we tend to minimize the impact of the tumor when in reality, the things that we have to go through are intense, they're hard, they're scary, overwhelming. I have a lot of different words for it. Having an easier time with treatment. We tend to develop guilt over the fact that maybe I have an easier time with treatment than somebody else. I have been through 2 different rounds of chemo. I've been through methotrexate and I've been through Nexavar. And I know that with Nexavar, I saw many people on social media who went through multiple years of being on Nexavar. And after 12 months, my doctor told me that my tumor looked stable and so I could discontinue it. And when I was told that I could discontinue Nexavar, I remember having such an internal conflict of, yes, I am so excited. I don't want to take this anymore. The side effects are hard, but also, why do I get to get off of Nexavar after 12 months? Why are some people on Nexavar for so much longer than that? And I can feel guilt and I can minimize my experience based off of how I'm comparing myself to other people's experiences. I'll also say The chemos that I was on, they were called low dose chemos by my doctor. And so I have made comments before in the past. I don't say them now, but in the past, I've made comments like, well, I don't know if I really had like real chemo, right? Because my doctors have called it low dose chemo, and they've reminded me that it's not as harsh as like doxorubicin or some of the other chemos. And with my chemo experience, my hair thinned dramatically, but I didn't lose all of my hair. And so I tended to relate my experience to other people who I saw go through chemo, who lost their hair. And I would tell myself their experience is worse than mine. Their experience is they're going through so much more than I am. And so I feel guilty that I don't have to go through that. And I also feel feelings of fraudulence, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Now, passing on our genes, this is not necessarily one that applies to desmoid tumor patients, but I have heard the anxiety pop up in people that I've spoken to of what if this gets passed along? What if I give something to my kids? What if I don't do things the right way and then this is something that affects or impacts my kids for the rest of their life? And passing on, whether it's genetic traits, passing on attitudes towards life, passing on motivation. What am I going to pass on as a result? And I feel guilty for those things that I'm going to pass on. Impacting the lives of others. Now, if you have been through diagnosis, if you have been through some form of treatment, then I'm sure I hope that you've had a support system, because it is a brutal thing to go through on your own. And the support system is such a necessary piece of being able to walk through these experiences. But with having a support system, we can have those feelings of, I have had to call on people and ask people to sacrifice themselves. I've had to ask people to give up their time, maybe give up their finances, to give up things in order to take care of or be there for me. And now I feel guilty because I've had to call on people who have had to sacrifice for me. At one point in my treatment, things got to be so difficult that I literally had to have people come over multiple times a day to help me walk my dog. I couldn't go down the stairs to take my dog out, to walk him. And so I had people who were taking shifts and taking turns, coming and walking my dog. And just the guilt of like, oh my goodness, I want to be able to do these things on my own, but I have to call on other people to be able to come and help me and support me during this time. The next four that we're going to talk about, I think, are also really pertinent to the desmoid experience. The next one says not doing the desmoid journey well. I don't know if you have felt this pressure, but especially if you're on social media, there tends to be a pressure of, I need to do this well. While I'm going through treatment, while I have this desmoid, I need to show that I am resilient. I need to show that I am strong. I need to show that this will not overcome me. And while all of those are very empowered things and ultimately very good, we have a tendency to put a pressure on ourselves to do this well. And that means something different for everybody. I've seen it mean I'm going to exercise throughout all of my treatment and I'm going to continue to stay active, or I am going to continue to go to work and I don't need to take breaks because this isn't going to impact me and I'm going to have the same level of production as I did before. And again, while some of those things are good, exercise is good, staying busy is good, engaging in work if we can is good, there tends to be this pressure that creates a guilt in us that can tell us we have to do this well, that we're not allowed to have bad days. This isn't allowed to be hard. This will not affect me. And we're going to talk about this one specifically a bit more as we get into toxic positivity, because especially with a desmoid tumor, especially with the messages that we can tell ourselves that this isn't real cancer or this isn't as bad as what other people go through, there's a tendency to put pressure on ourselves to do this experience well, not necessarily even knowing what well means. Now, not being enough of a survivor or an advocate. My mom had breast cancer about a decade and a half ago. And I remember whenever she finally got her clearance and finally could say that she was cured, her telling me, Ashley, like, I don't want to see a pink ribbon. I don't want to go to any of the 5Ks. I don't want to do any of it. I just want to close the chapter on this experience. I want to turn around. I want to move forward. Yet, I think we can put so much pressure on ourselves that if I have been through this experience, that if I have overcome, or I am in a period of a break, or I have some stability in my tumor, there's this pressure of I need to be an advocate. I need to be the premier ultimate survivor. I need to be able to communicate my gratitude for everything that I've been through. And again, while these are really good things, it isn't necessary in order for us to do a desmoid well, right? And so if we don't turn into an advocate necessarily for a diagnosis, that can create feelings of guilt in us and feelings of, I could be doing more, or I could be doing better. Kind of hand in hand with that is not having a life-changing experience. And I know I've seen this, again, I'm referencing social media a lot, but I feel like that's where a lot of these things are found, where not having a life-changing experience, we tend to see people who, once they are done with their treatments, they become like fitness gurus and health nuts, or become a triathlete, or do something in order to show appreciation for their life and gratitude for the things that they're still able to do, regardless of the hardship of their diagnosis. Again, these can be very, very good things, but they're not for everyone. And so if we haven't had some sort of life-changing experience, if we still, eat McDonald's and drink Coke, there might be some feelings of guilt in there of, my life should have changed. My life should be different. I should be doing this, or I should be doing that, based off of what I see other people doing who have been through my experience. And again, though, that can create feelings of guilt in us. And so as you can see, even just going through this list, it's a fairly comprehensive list, but it's not the totality of what it is to experience survivor's guilt. You can see all the intricacies and complexities of the guilt that we carry with having a diagnosis, and especially a desmoid diagnosis. The final one is feeling a lifelong responsibility to be there for those who were there for us. And I'm going to kind of piggyback off of that to go into this next piece of what are all of the different emotions that we experience. Because again, we've had to call on people to be there to support us, and that can create feelings of guilt. But also, going through so much hardship, going through suffering, going through pain, oftentimes it leads us to a place where we develop empathy and compassion for other people. And by developing empathy and compassion, we have an innate ability typically to be able to almost sniff out pain and hardship in other people. And sometimes I hear it a lot when people are unable to recognize that a friend or a family member or somebody that they're close to is going through a hard time. Again, there can be these intense feelings of guilt of, I know pain, I know suffering, I know hardship, and I was unable to sniff it out in the people who are closest to me, to be there to support them during their hardship and their suffering. Empathy tends to be a really strong feeling that we feel as a result of going through difficult things, going through hardship, that compassion that we develop for others, which can be really exhausting. But then again, we also put a lot of pressure on ourselves for how we show up for other people. Now, in the reverse, because empathy can be exhausting, or because our diagnosis can be so exhausting, or because the mental gymnastics that happen as a result of our diagnosis can be so exhausting, there's also a tendency to isolate when we experience survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt tends to be about, I don't belong in any of these circles. Everybody's experience is harder than mine. Who am I to show up in these spaces? My experience isn't as bad. It isn't as difficult. And so I have a tendency to isolate, which then can make what I'm going through that much harder, that much more challenging, that much more difficult, because we're now going through it alone. We can also feel anger And anger is one of those emotions where when we think about it, we know like, okay, we're not supposed to be angry. And so we try really hard not to be. But in reality, anger is a part of having a diagnosis. It's a part of the Desmoid journey. There are a lot of things to be angry about. And anger is a feeling that demands to be expressed. And there are healthy ways to express it. And we'll be talking about some of those in just a minute as well. We've talked in previous sessions about sadness, grief, and anxiety, and those pop up with survivor's guilt as well. And I want to say that guilt and grief are very connected to one another. And so when we feel guilt, there tends to be grief that is somewhere associated with it. Now, as we move through our Desmoid diagnosis, or as we move through either other arenas in our life where we might experience survivor's guilt, we tend to think that it's something that we can like get over, like we're trying to overcome an emotion. But in reality, emotions are things that we need to learn to like integrate into our life and our identity versus feeling like we need to overcome it. Because survivor's guilt is one of those things that has a tendency to pop up throughout our lives the same way that guilt does. For example, I may struggle with survivor's guilt right now, and I feel like I've overcome it to a sense. But then 10 years from now, what happens when I graduate from college? And I think, man, Kristen should have been here for this. Kristen should have been graduating with me. What happens when I get married? Kristen should have been my bridesmaid. She should have been here to watch this happen. Why do I get to experience marriage? Why do I get to experience parenthood or what it is to have a family? And Kristen doesn't get to experience it. Maybe I run a marathon and one of my friends is unable to do so because of their diagnosis. And I have those feelings later on in life of, man, why do I get to experience this joy and this accomplishment? And Kristen doesn't get the ability to do that. And so grief and guilt, the survivor's guilt, are really closely tied to each other. The final thing we experience is pressure, and we've kind of talked about that throughout all of these pieces, is that guilt tends to be about the pressure that we put on ourselves. We should be doing better. We should be doing more. We haven't done enough, or our experience isn't that bad. And therefore, I am not worthy to enter into specific spaces because my experience is not as bad as theirs. And I don't want to take those services away from those people. Now, how do we cope with it? I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because this is going to kind of repeat itself throughout the rest of our time tonight. But the first thing is remember that your diagnosis isn't your fault and it's nobody else's. I can't tell you how many times I have heard comments made directly to me or made to other people about how there seems to be a need or a desire to control our diagnosis, right? And so if I have a desmoid tumor, there must be something that I did to cause it. And so either I wasn't taking care of myself, or I wasn't exercising enough, or maybe I need to start, drinking celery juice in the mornings or taking black seed oil. I've heard all of these different things of what are the things that we can do to either not have this diagnosis or to cure ourselves from this diagnosis. And in reality, all of those things are an attempt to control our diagnosis in some way. And so I think it is such an important piece to remind ourselves that our diagnosis isn't our fault, and it's not somebody else's fault for the diagnosis that they have as well. The second thing is to recognize your feelings, and I've talked about this quite a bit in previous sessions, but it's so important to be able to put verbiage behind how we're feeling. And so that's part of the reason we're talking about some of these things of what is the difference between survivor's guilt, imposter syndrome, toxic positivity, so we can put words to them. Because if we know what we're experiencing, then we have an easier time being able to make sense of them and process them. We also need to be able to put words to the emotions that we're feeling in order to process them well. And so I've recommended this book before. I'm going to recommend it again. This book, Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. It's essentially like an encyclopedia of emotions, and each emotion has about 1 to 3 pages worth of an explanation. And so you can read one at a time. It's got about 90 emotions in here, 82 or 87, something like that. But this book is actually quite significant when it comes to healing and healing from trauma, and then healing from some of the things that might pop up in our minds as a result of the trauma that we've been through, because it gives us context and it gives us verbiage for the emotions that we experience. So I'm a big fan of this book. I use it every day. Know that your feelings of guilt will come and go. Just like grief, when we talked about, survivor's guilt is like it comes and goes in waves. And so there might be periods in our life where we go through months or years of not having those feelings, but then there's a big event, or there's an accomplishment, or there's a party, or there's something where we feel somebody else should be involved, but they're unable to do so, either because they're no longer with us or because they have a deformity or an illness or something that would keep them from doing the thing that we're doing. And so we can feel those feelings of guilt, like, why do I get to enjoy this and this other person doesn't? Expressing your feelings is very important. And we've talked about many ways to do this in past sessions, but I will reiterate, I am a huge fan of what's known as therapeutic journaling. And therapeutic journaling is essentially just setting a timer, 15 minutes. Research says doing it 4 times a week is the most beneficial. But 15 minutes in just writing stream of consciousness, what is on our mind. And at the end of today's training, I'm actually going to give you a prompt for writing a therapeutic journaling piece of how can I do that? How can I spend 15 minutes just trying to process some of the things that we learned today? And finally, be kind to yourself and others. When it comes to survivor's guilt, it tends to be a really critical voice about our experience and the things that we've been through. In recognizing, no, we've actually been through hard things. Being diagnosed with a desmoid is a hard thing. And so regardless of what anybody else's experience is, or regardless of how I feel I compare to that experience, a desmoid is a hard thing. And so recognizing that and being kind to yourself. The next thing we're going to talk about is imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is a feeling of phoniness in people. They live in fear of being found out or exposed as frauds. And imposter syndrome, where survivor's guilt is essentially, I'm looking at somebody else's experience and I'm comparing myself to it, and I'm feeling like mine is not as bad. Imposter syndrome takes it one step further of, actually, my experience is invalid and it's fraudulent, and I'm an imposter here. And I will tell you, with a desmoid tumor, I see this more than anything else. I have felt this in my own life, because we are so often put into the cancer community. And some of us may refer to our desmoid as cancer, some might not. I know there's a division on that. But being told by doctors that it's a benign tumor, that verbiage can be really, really difficult from a mental health perspective, because our experience is so consistent with the cancer experience. Our experience is hard, it's challenging, we go through a lot. Yet we're told that it is not cancer. We're told that it is not as bad. I was told by a doctor once that a desmoid is just an inconvenience and I shouldn't look at it as any more than that. And so feelings of imposter syndrome is, okay, I actually feel fraudulent. Like, I feel like this is hard, but I'm being told that this is different than what I'm seeing other people go through. And therefore, I'm actually like a fraud for feeling these ways, because I don't have real cancer, or I didn't go through real chemo, or I didn't do what real cancer patients do, you know? And so those feelings of imposter syndrome in the desmoid community especially can come on pretty strong. Imposter syndrome originated in the workplace, but it's something that can be felt in other realms of our life, and in health, very much so. So how do we experience it? Imposter syndrome tends to be feelings of self-doubt. We look at our experience through the lens of what other people are telling us, or through the lens of others' experiences, and we're rendering ours as completely invalid. We're telling ourselves that it's not hard, it's not bad, it's not what other people go through. I don't even belong here, you know? I don't belong in, I have a client that I work with. She's a young lady who is a part of the AYA, adolescent and young adult community. And she's been invited to so many AYA cancer groups, but says, I can't go to those. Like, I don't fit in there. If I were to go there, I would be lying. I would be an imposter. I would be fraudulent. Those people would find me out and they would know, or they would think that I was making things up because I have a benign tumor, right? And so I can't fit into the communities where I could potentially get resources to help me with what I'm going through because my experience is fraudulent. And so that doubting of ourself and our experience can come on pretty strong. Minimization of our experience, again, it's not that bad. Embarrassment of why am I here? Or why am I in this support group? Or why am I talking to other cancer patients online? Why am I engaging in this community? They're going to find out that I don't actually belong here, that lack of belonging. And then the same feelings of grief, anxiety, depression, because ultimately, especially with a desmoid tumor, I've always referred to it as like it's unclassifiable. We don't fit into any space really. And so we try to fit in to be able to get the resources that we need and to be able to get the help that we need. But sometimes it can feel so wrong and so fraudulent. It's one of the reasons I'm so thankful to the DTRF for doing these sessions and for all of the different things that we're able to do, especially with the weekends that happen in September of just being able to connect with other desmoid patients, because our diagnosis is so rare, it's so unclassifiable that it's difficult for us to feel like we belong in any other arena. Now, how do we cope with it with imposter syndrome? One of the most important things is to know the facts. Know the facts of your diagnosis, know the facts of what you've been through, know and be confident in the fact that what you've been through is hard. What you've been through is a lot. It is more than what others might have gone through. You know, it is extreme. And so knowing the facts and being able to write down what you have been through can help ground us whenever we start looking to other people to make sense of our experience. Eliminating comparison is extremely important. Now, I love social media. I've connected with so many people on social media. I've connected with so many desmoid patients on social media. But we have to be so careful to eliminate the comparison with other people, eliminating what the comparison of their experience versus ours. And rather than trying to define whose is inferior and whose is superior, knowing that we all have the ability to relate to each other just by the mere fact that we have a desmoid tumor diagnosis. So regardless of our experiences, we can relate and we can come together on that. Establishing the counter narrative just essentially means validating my experience. I need to validate that my experience is in fact hard, that I've been through a lot. And again, we can do that by knowing the facts of our diagnosis. Knowing your imposter moments just essentially means knowing your triggers for what makes you feel fraudulent. I shared earlier that the things that can cause me to feel that way is when I speak to someone who's been through a chemo where they've lost their hair. I haven't lost my hair completely. And so when I talk to somebody who has gone through doxorubicin or has gone through chemos where they have lost all of their hair, I can feel like, oh, this person has really been through it. Their experience is really one that's worthy of saying that they've been through something hard, and mine hasn't been that bad. And so I need to be able to acknowledge those so that I can establish that counter narrative of like, you know what, even though I didn't go on doxorubicin, I have been on methotrexate, I have been on Nexavar, I have been on these other things that have been challenging, and they posed challenges for me that I really had to work through. Recognizing your feelings, expressing your feelings, and being kind to yourself. That's going to be the three golden pieces of everything that we talk about, of recognizing, understanding what we're feeling, being able to express it in different ways. Again, I like journaling, but being active is a great way to get our emotion out. Talking with people that we trust, talking to a therapist. These are all great ways to be able to express and get those out. And then being kind to ourselves. Again, imposter syndrome tends to be a critical voice in our head. And so being kind to ourselves about the validity of our experience is extremely important. The final thing we're going to talk about is toxic positivity. And this one can also show up pretty extensively in our community. It's the overgeneralization of a happy, optimistic state that results in the denial, minimization, and invalidation of the authentic human emotional experience. So essentially, toxic positivity is that like good vibes only feeling. You know, you are not allowed to be sad. You are not allowed to be in pain. You are not allowed to be upset. Like, this isn't that hard. Just focus on the positive. I heard it once described to me as when you go through something like a desmoid diagnosis, imagine it like this storm is brewing and this storm is coming, and you're looking at this storm thinking, how am I going to withstand this? But people's reactions tend to be, Ashley, don't look at the storm, look at the rainbow. And if you don't see a rainbow, look harder. And if it doesn't show up, then you're doing it wrong, because the rainbow is the thing that you need to focus on. The storm doesn't actually exist. So don't pay attention to the storm, pay attention to the rainbow. Now, I think we've all probably experienced toxic positivity before because it is so steeped in our culture. Our culture very much embraces this idea of good vibes only and toxic positivity because people are often uncomfortable with the emotions that we perceive to be negative or that we perceive to be challenging. And so we really want to shift our focus away from those, and we want to focus just on like the pretty happy emotions. And so when we get something like a diagnosis that leads us to treatment or leads us to, you know, lifelong monitoring of the diagnosis, we tend to get people who will say things like, well, it's not that bad, or at least you have the good kind of diagnosis or rare disease or cancer or whatever you want to call it. It's just an inconvenience. Like, focus on the positive, focus on the good things. And it kind of renders the challenges that we have, again, it's being completely invalid. And so where survivor's guilt is about looking at other people's experience and comparing ourselves to their experience and deciding if ours is inferior or superior, and typically inferior, then imposter syndrome is, okay, I'm actually inferior to that person's experience. And so I'm actually just going to completely invalidate it altogether. Like, I'm fraudulent. My experience is nothing compared to theirs. And toxic positivity is when other people do that to us, when they tell us that our experience isn't as bad and they're making comparisons for us and telling us how we should feel and how we should behave. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen The Cancer Patient on Instagram. It's an Instagram account, and I think that a lot of the things that are posted are very pertinent to the desmoid journey. It's a very like satirical Instagram account, but they post a lot of things about toxic positivity, and these kind of highlight those, where we have all of these big things going on. Our life has changed in a moment with the diagnosis. We're faced with potentially life-altering consequences, fertility, health, mobility, like all sorts of different things. And people just tell us, like, just stay positive, just pray, just look to the good things, just write your gratitude journal, just do all of these things and focus on what's good and don't focus on what's hard. That can be a very invalidating experience for us. So how do we cope with it? We want to recognize toxic positivity messages. And then the second thing is understanding the difference between toxic positivity and positivity. Positivity in and of itself is a very evidence-based approach to being able to effectively cope with hardships in our life. But the difference between toxic positivity and positivity is that toxic positivity does not allow you to acknowledge that the storm exists. Toxic positivity is good vibes only. The bad, the hard, the difficult, it's not allowed to exist. You can only focus on the good. And if you're not focusing only on the good, then you're not doing this right. Positivity creates space for us to be able to accept both the hard and the things that we can be grateful for. Chemo can be both terrible and nauseating and awful, but it can also be appreciated because we have a method that can combat and potentially shrink or potentially stabilize our tumor. So I can be thankful for it, but I can also hate it at the same time. I can carry both of those at the same time instead of just having to choose one to be positive all the time. I think in our community, it's also important to avoid toxic negativity, which is essentially, I'm only going to focus on the storm. I'm only going to focus on the bad and the hard and the challenging. And I'm not going to allow myself to look at what are the potential positives, not of my diagnosis, because we don't have to be grateful for our diagnosis. We don't have to, be okay with our diagnosis. We can not be okay with the fact that we had a diagnosis, but even in the hardships, we can still find things to be grateful for and things to be thankful for and areas to be positive. And so we want to avoid kind of having to choose one of those, right? We don't want to be always positive all the time and avoiding the negative. We don't want to be always negative all the time and avoiding the positive. We want to be able to walk in both of those at the same time. And again, recognizing your feelings, expressing your feelings, and being kind to yourself. And I think with toxic positivity, it's also just as important not to just be kind to ourselves, but to be kind to others. Because sometimes, I'm sure y'all have had this experience before where you're just like, what would possess a person to say that to me? Like, that is just such a bizarre comment to make. That is just so inappropriate. It is so demoralizing, so discouraging. But I think especially in our culture, and especially in a culture where we have been raised to focus on the positive and to achieve the positive and to try to always be happy all the time, that sometimes people don't know how to deal with hardship and how to deal with grief, and it can come out in awkward and bizarre statements. And so I think when it comes to toxic positivity, yes, being kind to ourselves and that, but also being kind to others, extending grace, knowing that people don't always know the right things to say, but 9 times out of 10, it's coming from a genuine good place of wanting to say the right thing, but just absolutely not knowing what to say, and finding something to say that is more in line with a cultural perspective than it is with someone who's experienced hardship and experienced suffering. If you've felt this toxic positivity before, this book, Toxic Positivity, is phenomenal. It's really good. It talks about why it exists in our culture. It talks about the different shapes and forms of it, especially in regards to our physical health, and how physical health challenges can be so invalidated nowadays because we're just supposed to think positive. And that also goes hand in hand with the fact that many people also, again, want to control a diagnosis or an illness. And so oftentimes we might receive messages that we're to blame or we're responsible for our diagnosis. That falls into this realm of toxic positivity as well. Now, I said I was going to leave you with a stream of consciousness journaling prompt, a therapeutic prompt. And so I encourage you to write this down before we exit today. I'll leave this up on the screen. It's a pretty vague question, but that is important for allowing for the creative process to take you where it takes you whenever you're journaling versus trying to write a very prescriptive narrative of some sort. But I think we've all experienced at least one of these in some way. And so giving yourself maybe tonight, after we end, a couple of minutes of just being able to write and journal through which of these topic areas out of survivor's guilt, imposter syndrome, or toxic positivity has posed the greatest challenge for you during your diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. And writing through that and seeing what comes out for you. Because again, with these 3 things, with survivor's guilt, imposter syndrome, and toxic positivity, there are also 3 things that we tend to not acknowledge or validate very often, because they tend to promote feelings of guilt or shame. They tend to make us feel isolated and make us feel like we don't belong. And so we often don't allow ourselves to really engage with those or experience those. And so giving yourself some space and time to be able to write through these things can be a pretty powerful exercise. So I leave you with that. We have a couple of minutes to open it up for questions. If there are any questions about these topics in particular, or about how these topics relate to the Desmoid experience specifically. But Lynn, I'll pass it over to you to throw out any questions that we might have.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so much, Ashley. I do have a couple questions for you. One, I believe, is probably on the cusp of the journaling piece that you were talking about. So someone is asking if you would recommend any other journal prompts off the top of your head.
I think that there's several good ones. And I tend to again, the therapeutic journaling is not necessarily having a prompt. It's more stream of consciousness, like what is on your mind right now, and writing through that for 15 minutes. And so even saying like stream of consciousness might look like, Ashley told me to write about survivor's guilt, and so I'm trying to write about survivor's guilt. It doesn't necessarily have to be a beautiful like poem or narrative. Really just taking what's in my brain and putting it out on paper. But I think one prompt that is actually really powerful to help process some of the things that we've talked about today is almost taking like a paper and dividing it into two sides. And on one side, writing a realistic assertion or a realistic statement, like chemo is hard and it is nauseating and I feel sick all the time and I'm exhausted and I don't want to work, like whatever the realistic statement is about what you're experiencing. And then on the other side of the paper, writing something that is, what am I thankful for? What am I grateful for in regards to this thing where my experience is hard? And so again, I can hate the fact that I had to go through chemo and chemo was nauseating and I couldn't keep food down and I hated it. But I can also say, I'm thankful that this chemo is working on my tumor and that I got time off from treatment for a year and a half because this chemo worked. And so being able to take both the realistic and the hard and coupling it with something that we can find gratitude for or that we can be thankful for. And it doesn't even have to be about chemo. We don't have to be thankful for chemo, but something in our experience, like our support system or the people who were there for us, and being able to give voice again to both the positive and the negative of our experience without necessarily feeling like we have to choose one over the other. I think doing that exercise of having both of those columns next to each other is really, really powerful in processing just the reality of our experience.
That's great. That's great. It makes me think of this. It makes me think of this meditation that I listened to one time that was talking about duality and was talking about, being able to hold these, two different things at the same time, right? And acknowledge that they can both be true. They can both be real.
Yeah.
So we have another question. Someone is asking, how would I find a therapist that would understand a desmoid tumor diagnosis and the fact that this tumor is just, the classification is so vague?
That's a really difficult one. Finding the right therapist can be really, really challenging, and it can be an exhausting experience because it is like we have to create a relationship with that person and feel comfortable with that person to be able to express not only the deep things that we're going through, but we want someone to have some sort of understanding. It might not be the exact same experience, but to understand some of these like nuances and complexities of what we have been going through. I can give two recommendations. The first one is connecting with other desmoid patients and hearing from them the things that have worked for them or the therapists that they might meet with or the groups that they're a part of. Being able to connect with people who understand our experience is really important. I'll also say that I am a therapist and I do coaching for those who aren't necessarily in the states that I'm licensed in. And so my email address is also listed. And if that's something that you're interested in, we can talk about that as well, because I know that it is hard. I wish I had a catalog for you of people who understood the desmoid experience and who were clinically trained, but it's uncommon. So I know it's a hard thing to navigate.
So just one thing quickly. So Ashley, you mentioned that your contact information is on here. I think it's on your first slide. If you want to go back to that so people can see it. And we do have another question. Someone is asking, can you give some examples on how I could validate my experience?
Yeah, I mean, again, and I'm overgeneralizing here, but as a desmoid patient, I think the tendency that I see is that we tend to minimize or invalidate our experience whenever we're comparing it to other people's experiences. And that is often reinforced by our medical teams and our doctors just in the classification of a desmoid tumor. And so validating our experience is really important, of being able to recognize, you know what we've been through is actually really hard. And there are multiple different ways to do this, both privately and publicly. And so privately, it might be taking some very intentional time, writing through, journaling through, like, what has been challenging about my experience? What is the reality of what I've had to go through? What is the reality of my hardships, and validating that for myself? I've spoken to some people recently. I mentioned her earlier, a client that I have who recently decided to post on her Instagram for AYA, Adolescent and Young Adult Cancer Week. She has dealt with the desmoid for almost like 7 or 8 years, and she doesn't share it with her friends. She doesn't share her experience with other people. And often it's just because I don't want to burden people with what I'm going through. And so publicly sharing, whether it's on social media, whether it's initiating a conversation with a family member or a friend, but really being able to share, whether it is writing it down or whether it's speaking it out to someone or putting it somewhere, of what is my experience, and like having other people witness that. The witnessing is a really, really powerful part of making meaning of what we've been through. And so anything that we can do that feels safe, whether again, that's with a therapist, a friend, a group of people on social media, but anything that we can do to just have someone witness what we've been through and be honest about our experience, not sugarcoat it and not minimize it because we think it is not as bad as somebody else's.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ashley. This
Of
was,
course.
I mean, these topics that you're covering are phenomenal. And I think that the tools that you're offering are so valuable as well. We also want to thank the desmoid tumor patient and caregiver community for joining us as well. Please note that we will be sharing a recording of this webinar after it's edited. In roughly, it takes about 2 weeks for us to do that. But in the meantime, all other Dealing with Desmoids webinars can be found at dtrf.org/dealing with desmoids, all together is one word. So make sure that you go to our website to subscribe to our mailing list, so you can make sure that you get a notification when we push this out to the public. We'll also, on that page, we'll also have whatever notice. As soon as we schedule another one, we'll put it on that page. And also make sure that you go to our website and join us for the Together We Will weekend, which will take place in Philadelphia from September 22nd to the 24th. We would love to see you. And that's pretty much it. So Ashley, let's give Ashley a virtual round of applause. Thank you, Ashley, as always. And we hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Yes.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye, everybody. Bye, Ashley.
Bye.